transgender ideology has spread like wildfire. The trans movement has nothing to do with trans rights and everything to do with creating confusion and chaos among the younger generations. It's poisoning their minds, confusing them about the most basic concepts of biology, and pushing them into making irreversible changes that they don't fully understand. It feeds on children already suffering from mental health issues, while driving for policies that threaten to take these kids away from their parents. It preys on their loneliness and pain and promises them salvation through a transgender identity. This is one of the most toxic movements today. It pretends to be another human rights movement, like the civil rights or the gay rights movement, but in reality, it has nothing to do with them. This ideology manipulates people's compassion and political correctness, while behind closed doors, it performs medical transitions that are sterilizing and mutilating our children. And it's time that we got clear about its true motives. If you're new here, my name is Roni, and on this channel, we dive deep into human nature to help us become everything we're meant to be, by building authentic lives filled with meaning and connection. This isn't an easy topic to talk about, but if you know me already, then you know I'm committed to bringing you the truth, even when it's uncomfortable and even when it's politically incorrect. Trans ideology is lying to our children about the realities of human nature and filling their heads with nonsense about gender fluidity. Their gender identity becomes the only source of meaning in their life, while the rest of the world loses its meaning for them completely. It robs them of any chance of real, healthy connection and tears them away from their families. And it has destroyed countless lives. We have to protect the younger generation from these toxic ideas, and we can only do that by understanding what they really are. In this video, I'm going to walk you through some critical points on this issue. First, I'll cover the history of transgender research and the two real types of transgender profiles that were widely accepted within the research community. These are androphilia and autogynephilia. Then, I'll get into the transgender craze we're seeing today, which is called rapid-onset gender dysphoria. This type is a completely new phenomenon that never existed before. So where did it come from? Gender activists, gender ideology, and social contagion. And lastly, I'll go into how gender ideology is sweeping through our schools, institutions, and the psychology and medical professions. You honestly won't believe what's happening behind the scenes right now. All of these institutions are now pushing something that's called gender-affirming care, which sounds harmless, right? Until you understand that it means sterilizing and mutilating young children before they understand the real lifelong consequences of what they're doing. Buckle up, guys. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Let's start with the history of transgender research. For decades, two classic types have been recognized in transgender research: androphilia and autogynephilia. So what do these terms mean? Androphilia basically stands for the love of men. Andro means men, and philia means love. On the other hand, autogynephilia means a love or attraction to oneself as a woman. Auto means self, like in the word autobiography. Gyno means woman, like in the term gynecologist. And philia, again, means love or attraction to. Now, before we dive in, I want to be clear. My point here is not to demonize these people, but I do want to help you understand the distinct types of transgender profiles so you can better identify them. And I'm absolutely against the gender ideology that has corrupted our schools and the psychological and medical professions. And I object unequivocally to the sadistic practice of gender-affirming care. Make no mistake, gender-affirming care is a code word for the manipulation, sterilization, and mutilation of young, vulnerable children. Let's start with androphilia. Another word for androphilia is early onset gender dysphoria. This was seen in a very small percentage of young boys who basically showed gender nonconforming behaviors and interests from a very young age. They were more feminine in what they like to do and how they like to play. They wanted to dress up in girl clothes and wear makeup. They also showed a certain level of discomfort and distress with the fact that they were boys. They would often get into fantasy or imaginary play where they pretended to be girls. Sometimes they would even go further and insist that they actually were girls. Now, there's been some great research on this by Kenneth Zucker. In his paper, Gender Identity Disorder and Psychosexual Problems in Children and Adolescents, he describes the typical development of gender dysphoria in young boys. I'm going to read you quite a long paragraph, but it describes perfectly how these young boys evolve. The boy has a temperamental predisposition to poor anxiety tolerance. During his infancy, his mother feels depressed and overwhelmed in relation to her own difficulty dealing with the demands of parenting, her husband's unsupportiveness, or other difficulties related to either illness in the child or in other members of the family. More often than not, this mother has ambivalent feelings towards males, which her sensitive son perceives. As well, this child may observe his mother's preference of female siblings or experience a sense that his mother would prefer him as female and as nurturing or supportive of her. In this context, the boy, who is in the midst of consolidating his gender identity, may, in an effort to obtain his mother's valuing, begin to act in a feminine manner. Parental conflict, often revolving around the father's absence or non-support of the mother, further increases the child's insecurity. Difficulty with affect regulation reinforces the child's need to diminish his felt distress and to find ways of feeling more secure, a function which the cross-dressing and other feminine behaviors seems to serve. When this behavior is not discouraged, the child begins to develop a sense of himself as being valued for the feminine characteristics that he displays and as devalued for the masculine characteristics that he might have. As the child enters the world of peers, his predisposition to avoid rough-and-tumble play and nascent interest in feminine activities leads him to join in the play of girls. Parental reactions, such as the father's withdrawal, further his sense of devaluation. Usually, parents start to become uncomfortable with what they have been perceiving as a phase that the child has not outgrown. Their discouragement of the behavior at this point, if not accompanied by other manifestations of their valuing of the child, may drive the behavior underground, leaving the child clinging to an internal but valued feminine self. As the child moves through middle childhood, he becomes increasingly isolated because of peer rejection and may spend considerable time in a fantasied elaboration of his female self. The profile of early onset gender dysphoria is real, but here's the important thing. They found that boys with early onset gender dysphoria often grew out of it. Throughout their childhood, they experienced a sincere discomfort with being boys, and often their naturally feminine personality manifested into an all-consuming fantasy of being girls, which was really a coping mechanism for their poor anxiety tolerance and emotional regulation, as well as their complicated and ambivalent relationships with their parents. But these boys grew out of it. They grew comfortable with being men as they matured and went through the natural hormonal transformation of puberty. Often, they simply grew up to be gay men, of the more feminine variety. They went on to live very comfortable lives as men who were simply attracted to other men.
And Zucker ran a clinic for gender dysphoric kids way before this became part of the culture war, let's say. And he was a very straight and honest scientist, a very good researcher, not a political person. And what he showed was, what his clinic showed, many peer-reviewed studies, was that gender dysphoria of the type that you described is relatively rare. But if you leave kids alone till they're 19 or 18, 80 to 90% of them settle into their biological identity. Although about 80% of them are also homosexual in their orientation. And so the pathway for him, before this was all politicized, was you'd have a child who was gender nonconforming temperamentally, and then prone to depression and anxiety, and then that combination would produce this gender dysphoria, and that would become quite intense around the dawn of puberty. But if you just backed the hell off and waited, those kids would settle into their body, but generally adopt a homosexual orientation.
In another paper regarding the treatment of children with gender dysphoria, Zucker writes the following: for children who present clinically with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, long-term follow-up studies suggest that their gender identity is not necessarily fixed. The majority of children followed over time appear to lose the diagnosis of gender dysphoria when seen in late adolescence or young adulthood, and appear to have differentiated a gender identity that matches their natal sex. In terms of treatment, Zucker found that addressing underlying mental health issues is key, along with helping these children socially integrate with same-sex peers. Regarding setting limits around their feminine fantasy play, he explains that the goal isn't to be authoritarian and aggressively rejecting of these tendencies. He writes, "Rather, the goal is to help the child feel more comfortable in his or her own skin." So instead of making their gender dysphoria worse and teaching them that the only way they will be happy is if they sterilize themselves with puberty blockers and estrogen and then castrate themselves, maybe we should actually help these children using methods that have been proven to work. Maybe we should address their underlying mental health issues and family dynamics, which are the true cause of their suffering. At the end of the day, these boys can't turn into women. Gender dysphoria literally means an intense experience of discomfort with one's own sex. Why would we want to feed into this discomfort? Why would we want to ignore their other serious mental health and social issues? Why not help them feel comfortable with their biological sex? The gender activists like to call this conversion therapy, as if they really are girls that we're trying to force to be men. But conversion therapy doesn't have to do with gender identity. It has to do with sexual orientation, and no one is trying to change these boys' sexual orientation. Many of them grow up to be happy, functioning, fulfilled gay men. Many gay men today are outraged by the sterilization and mutilation of young gay boys.
I'm gay. When I was young, I was a feminine fake kid. If I was a gay feminine kid today, they would have whipped up your dick off. They would have taken my manhood. They would have taken my manhood.
Playing along with this crazed gender ideology in the name of trans rights and compassion is pure evil. We are harming these kids when there is good, solid research that they can be helped. What an upside-down world we live in. Let's talk about autogynephilia. These are adult men who have a sexual fetish of imagining themselves as women. One of the leading researchers studying these kinds of men is Ray Blanchard. In his 1993 paper, Varieties of Autogynephilia and Their Relationship to Gender Dysphoria, Blanchard describes it like this. The term autogynephilia was coined to denote a male's paraphilic tendency to be sexually aroused by the thought or image of himself as a female. Paraphilia is academic speak for an unusual fetish that is outside the norm. Men with autogynephilia are most often adult men, anywhere from 20 years old onwards. The beginnings of these fantasies can start around puberty or a bit later. One of the classic profiles of autogynephilia is a middle-aged man, usually married and with a couple of kids, who almost overnight proclaims that he is, in fact, a woman. The fetish usually starts in secret, wearing his wife's clothes, her lingerie, her jewelry, and her makeup. This kind of man gets aroused by seeing himself as a woman. And these cross-dressing rituals usually end in masturbation.
I'm just a sweet transvestite from transsexual Transylvania.
Now, autogynephilia doesn't always stop at cross-dressing. There are also men who go a few steps further. Blanchard puts it this way. Autogynephilic fantasies and behaviors, in addition to the familiar example of cross-dressing, may focus on the idea of possessing female anatomic structures, of exhibiting female physiological functions, or of engaging in stereotypically feminine behavior. Prime examples of physiological fantasies are those occasional males called pregnancy transvestites, who masturbate with the fantasy of being a pregnant woman or of giving birth. There are, in a similar vein, men whose favorite masturbation fantasy is that they are lactating or breastfeeding, and others whose favorite fantasy is that of menstruating. Sorry for being so graphic, but there you have it. One important distinction is that these men are considered non-homosexual transsexuals. In other words, heterosexual, which is entirely different from androphilic men, who are homosexual. Today, these are the types of men who aggressively insist that they're real women. These are the kinds of guys you see filming themselves getting all high and mighty when they've been misgendered.
Hi.
I use she, her pronouns. I'm not sir. Yeah, like it's like a knife in the heart. I did specifically ask ahead of time not to be called sir. Yeah, I'm just gonna go.
Okay.
Yeah, the Sweetwater starts at
Yes,
okay.
sir.
Not.
I'm so sorry. I apologize.
It's just always like a knife. It always hurts every single time. I was wondering if there's a manager I could talk to about something that happened. Yeah, I was called sir. Oh, okay. It just really sucks every time it happens. Sorry about that. I don't need to be called ma'am. I just need to not be called sir, you know? Thank you. Did you call me sir? I just want to tell you that the person who gave me this called me sir.
What?
Call me sir.
Oh. That.
It's just like, it kind of just hurts a lot to get called sir.
Oh, sorry about that.
They want everyone to go along with the fantasy. Otherwise, their bubbles burst and the show's over. These are the kinds of men who try to impose themselves into women-only spaces, like women's bathrooms and women's locker rooms. And these are exactly the guys who insist on competing in women's sports.
This national championships where we had Leah Thomas, who is a male, a man, self-identifying as a woman. We were told we fully had to treat this person as a woman, right? This same national championships, we had another athlete who was transitioning. But this athlete is a female who was then self-identifying as a man from Yale. Izzy now goes by the name of Isaac. And we were told we fully had to treat this person as a man. Okay, finals of the 100 freestyle. Top 8 women in the entire nation.
Air quotes women.
Air quotes women. Yeah, for those that don't have video, air quotes women. Top 8 women in the entire country. And you've got a 6'4" man in a women's swimsuit with a bulge next to a woman wearing only a Speedo with nothing covering her top. Your reaction was my reaction, because I'm sitting there watching this. I'm thinking to myself, it's me. I'm the crazy one. Thomas's teammates, right? 16 of these girls, plus their parents at the beginning of the season, signed on to a letter expressing their discomfort in the locker room. I kid you not. The university responded back with, and I have a screenshot of their response. If you, as women, feel uncomfortable seeing male genitalia, here are some counseling resources that you should seek in an attempt to re-educate yourselves.
Re-educate yourself that that's a she-ness. It's not a penis.
It's a she-ness.
Oh.
Queeness penis. At the time of that national championships, he was still dating women and active with women.
So
Yeah.
if you're on that team, you're a woman and you have a biological male who's intact, who's having sex with women, walking around naked in the locker room with women, and if you're uncomfortable with that, you should educate yourself.
You
and
said
learn how to use she, her pronouns and accept defeat. And because of this insane cult that 45% of the country's in, or whatever it is, you have to deal with this literal mental patient in a woman's sport dominating, and everyone's cheering.
Yes.
And everyone around it that's watching it is upset. All the parents, probably on both teams.
Of course.
All the women that are competing with this man, and the whole world's like, yay, diversity. And you must feel like you're in a fucking movie or something.
They force the people around them to go along with their delusion. And the crazy thing is, people actually go along with it. In contrast to androphilic men, who are usually petite and feminine in appearance, autogynephilic men often look quite masculine. Michael Bailey summarized a lot of Blanchard's work in his book, Men Trapped in Men's Bodies. He describes the masculine presentation of these men like this. The fact is that despite their obsession with becoming women, autogynephilic transsexuals are not especially feminine. This contrasts greatly with the childhood histories of homosexual transsexuals whose femininity was remarkable to anyone who observed them closely. The fact is that despite their obsession with becoming women, autogynephilic transsexuals are not especially feminine. This contrasts greatly with the childhood histories of homosexual transsexuals whose femininity was remarkable to anyone who observed them closely. Nor are autogynephiles especially feminine adults. They rarely have stereotypically female occupations. Hence the apparent Adam's apple, muscle tone, large forearms and hands, and obvious superior upper body strength. Remember the woman in the Olympics who was punched in the face by a biological man?
I have never been hit so hard, said Italian boxer Angela Carini, in tears, after leaving the ring just 46 seconds into her fight against Algerian boxer Imani Khelif.
And she had to apologize to him. These guys may wear women's clothes in public and take estrogen, which might make them a little rounder in appearance because of the altered fat distribution, but even with these changes, their presentation often makes people uncomfortable. They have the skeletal build of grown men. And the important point here is that they don't only want people to accept their fantasy, but they become aggressive and hostile when people don't. A good portion of gender activists today fit this profile of autogynephilic men, though definitely not all. These are the men who dress in provocative, hypersexualized women's clothing and parade themselves in front of children. And this is done all in the name of raising awareness of trans people, promoting trans rights, and reducing transphobia. Now, when it comes to forcing people to buy the idea that they have always been women trapped in men's bodies, Bailey writes the following: most gender patients lie. One common lie among autogynephiles is that they are homosexual rather than heterosexual. The motivation for that lie is probably the fear that a gender clinic will deny them a sex change if they are determined to be heterosexual. Other common lies include an exaggeration of early femininity. My point here is not to demonize these people, but I do want to help you understand what transgender actually means, and to make it clear that this autogynephilia is a sexual fetish of adult men. We can perhaps be tolerant of their wish to display themselves as women in public, though even that's debatable. But we absolutely do not have to tolerate their infringement into women-only spaces, women's sports, or to let them parade their fetish in front of minors. We can respect their self-expression as long as they remain decent, but we do not have to submit to the bullying that requires us to play along with their delusion and to claim that they are real women. We do not have to apologize for misgendering someone who is clearly a grown man. I think you get the picture. Now, rapid-onset gender dysphoria is a completely new phenomenon. The reason it's called rapid onset is because it appears almost overnight in girls and boys who have never showed any signs of being particularly gender nonconforming or being uncomfortable with their sex. The average age of rapid onset gender dysphoria is 15 years old, but ages can range from 10 to 20. Multiple studies show that 60 to 80% of these cases happen in teenage girls. It never existed before, and certainly never within this demographic. So what's the real cause? Social contagion and gender ideology. Let's start with social contagion. Teenage girls have historically always been the demographic who's most vulnerable to social contagion, from hysteria, lobotomies, multiple personality disorder, anorexia, and cutting. There have been several remarkable pioneers researching this phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. To name just a few, we have Abigail Schreier, Miriam Grossman, and Lisa Littman. In Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, she talks exactly about the social contagion phenomenon. Two patterns stood out. First, the clear majority, 65%, of the adolescent girls who had discovered transgender identity in adolescence out of the blue had done so after a period of prolonged social media immersion. Second, the prevalence of transgender identification within some of the girls' friend groups was more than 70 times the expected rate. These girls discovered their transgender identity by way of social contagion, through social media and their immediate friend groups.
Lisa Littman, the public health researcher who did the original scientific research on this, found that there was a 70 times greater prevalence rate among friend groups, meaning you were 70 times more likely to announce a transgender identity if you were part of one of these, if you were part of a friend group in which other kids had done that as well. these were numbers that all pointed to the idea of social contagion. These were indicators that all pointed to the idea that this wasn't so much organic gender dysphoria as we had always known it, but a kind of social contagion, which means young people encouraging each other in an idea that there was something wrong with them. And they had, this particular idea wasn't that they were so fat, because we know that anorexia spreads this way as well, or bulimia, which also does. But in fact, this idea was, I'm in the wrong body and I need to change.
Lisa Littman's research has laid much of the foundation of hardcore research on this demographic. Her seminal paper on this issue involved collecting parent reports about how their children one day decided that they were trans, out of the blue, and how these teenagers had never showed any signs of gender dysphoria beforehand. Most importantly, she collected these children's long history of mental health issues, including social difficulties, psychiatric disorders, and traumatic experiences. I have to be honest with you guys, I was sitting at a cafe when I was reading her paper, and I had to fight back tears when I went through the mental health issues that she listed. I then went to wipe my tears in an all-gender bathroom with a urinal, a changing table, and a tampon vending machine. You cannot make this stuff up. So why did I get so emotional? Because this cruel transgender ideology is being targeted at the most vulnerable children, the ones who most need true and honest emotional support. And instead, they're being pushed into puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and sadistic, mutilating surgeries that leave them infertile and deformed for the rest of their lives. The psychologists and doctors who are pushing this and letting this happen are monsters, full stop. So let's go through these children's real mental health issues, shall we? Most of these adolescents and young adults had multiple underlying issues, including psychiatric disorders, neurodevelopmental disabilities, trauma, non-suicidal self-injury, and difficulties coping with strong or negative emotions. The majority, 62.5% of adolescents and young adults, had one or more diagnoses of a psychiatric disorder or neurodevelopmental disability preceding the onset of gender dysphoria. Range of the number of pre-existing diagnoses was 0 to 7. Many, 48.4%, had experienced a traumatic or stressful event prior to the onset of their gender dysphoria. Open text descriptions of trauma were categorized as family, including parental divorce, death of a parent, or a mental disorder in a sibling or parent. Then we have sex or gender related, such as rape, attempted rape, sexual harassment, abusive dating relationship, or a breakup. Then we have social, such as bullying or social isolation. Then there's moving, family relocation or change of schools. And then we have psychiatric, such as psychiatric hospitalization, and medical, such as serious illness or medical hospitalization. Almost half, 45% of adolescent and young adults were engaging in non-suicidal self-injury behavior before the onset of gender dysphoria. Coping styles for these adolescents and young adults included having a poor or extremely poor ability to handle negative emotions productively, 58%, and being overwhelmed by strong emotions and trying to avoid or go to great lengths to avoid experiencing them, 61.4%. The majority of respondents, 69.4%, answered that their child had social anxiety during adolescence, 44.3% that their child had difficulty interacting with their peers, and 43.1% that their child had a history of being isolated, not associating with their peers outside of school activities. These are the loneliest, most sensitive kids who have the hardest time dealing with their negative emotions. These are the children who have a hard time making friends and have been constantly bullied and excluded. These are the children who have an underlying mental health disorder, whether it's depression, anxiety, emotional regulation issues, poor social skills, or sometimes even schizophrenia or are on the autism spectrum. These are the children who've suffered traumatic experiences that were so overwhelming that they left them shattered, confused, and hopeless. And when they find this trans ideology on the internet, it feels like it's the answer to all their problems. They withdraw into their rooms and binge this manipulative transgender ideology content. They watch endless hours of YouTube videos of trans activists talking about how wonderful they feel after their transitions. They watch these trans activists injecting themselves with testosterone and celebrating how amazing they feel. And then one day, out of the blue, they come out to their parents and declare that they are in fact boys. They demand that their parents call them by their new boy's name and use their preferred pronouns. If you want more proof, Lisa found that 63% of the adolescents in her study showed an extreme increase in social media use before declaring they were trans. She also outlined some messages they pick up from trans influencers and Reddit forums. How to tell if you're transgender, the reasons you should transition right away. If you wait to transition, you'll regret it. If you don't transition immediately, you'll never be happy. If your parents don't agree to take you for hormones, then your parents are abusive and transphobic. If your parents are reluctant to take you for hormones, then you should use the suicide narrative to convince them, telling the parents that there is a high rate of suicide in transgender teens. How to order physical items, binders, packers, etc., without parents finding out. How to hide or make excuses for physical changes. How to get money from others online in order to pay for medications. How to get hormones from online sources. How to hide hormones from parents. How to hide physical items from parents. It's acceptable to lie to or withhold information about one's medical or psychological history from a doctor or therapist in order to get hormones or get them faster. What to say and what not to say to a doctor or therapist in order to convince them to provide hormones. They get the message that what will solve all of their problems is transitioning by getting puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and cutting off their breasts or even removing their uterus. And transgender boys are encouraged to get castrated. Many of the girls who experience rapid-onset gender dysphoria are deeply distressed. More often than not, they are not asked anything about their actual underlying mental health disorders by their psychologists or doctors. This is insane. What the psychological and medical professions now do whenever they receive a child like this is immediately affirm their gender. They start using the child's preferred pronouns and their new name. They never ask them about any of their emotional or social issues. A lot of parents are completely dumbfounded by the fact that their child shows up one day and demands that they call them by a different name and different pronouns. Naturally, these parents take them to see a psychologist or a doctor because they don't know what to do. You can have a lot of sympathy for these parents. Now, they leave the child with a psychologist and they don't realize what's happening behind closed doors. The psychologist may even go so far as to tell the child that anyone who disagrees is bigoted and abusive. The child is told that anyone who doesn't affirm them doesn't love them and is against them. This makes the child more hostile, angry, and withdrawn from their family. It makes it even harder for the parents to know what's going on or to help their child. Now, Miriam Grossman wrote an incredible book outlining the extent of gender-affirming care called Lost in Transnation. Miriam writes about the suicidal ideation coming from the psychologists and doctors themselves. A common tactic was for doctors to tell the parent of a child assigned female at birth, you can either have a living son or a dead daughter. The clinicians would say this to parents in front of their children. That introduced the idea of suicide to the children. The suicide assertion was also based on false statistics. In her book, Miriam talks about everything from gender ideology in schools, to the medical implications of transitioning, to the betrayal of the psychologists and doctors, and the grim stories of regret from detransitioners. Miriam wrote a personal experience she had treating a troubled girl whose name was Emma. Emma's mother died when she was young, and she always had difficulties making friends and handling her grief and depression. She would often engage in non-suicidal self-injury, which is a fancy way of saying cutting. One day, she announced to her father that she was a boy and her name was Oliver. Miriam started treating Emma, and instead of going along with her new trans identity, helped her with her emotional regulation, grief, social skills, and how to find ways to manage her distress instead of cutting. The progress they were making was promising, until one day, Emma was viciously bullied by some girls in her class. Emma's response was to cut her wrists so deep that she had to be admitted to the hospital. Her father was told she needed to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital. He called Miriam in a panic, because he knew exactly what would happen to her if she was admitted. And he was right. Miriam writes the following: "The moment Emma enters the hospital, she becomes Oliver, with or without Chris's agreement. Staff will call her Oliver, he and him, exclusively, instead of Emma, she and her, what they call her birth-assigned name and gender. Hospital staff are trained in how their gender-affirming speech creates a welcoming and safe place, and warned of the dire consequences of failing to do so. Once a patient tells you their name and gender, it's important to continue using them. Refusing to acknowledge their gender identity and choice of language harms the therapeutic relationship, is discriminatory, and insults the patient. Furthermore, this may add to any trauma they've already experienced and possibly foster increased thoughts of suicide and self-harm." Instead of trying to understand why Emma was cutting herself and helping her navigate her anxiety and depression, the hospital played along with her delusion and gave her binders to wrap around her breasts. This is but one of many stories of how children are abused by the trans ideology of these medical institutions. So there you have it. These helpless parents who want the best for their children take them to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. They're then betrayed by these so-called professionals who, instead of helping their child with their underlying mental health issues, just feed into their gender dysphoria delusions and even train them in suicidal ideation if their parents don't accept their trans identity. So what does gender-affirming care actually mean? In a speech Abigail Schreier gave, she talks about the usual process these kids go through.
And the typical next step for these kids after changing their name and pronouns to their friends and classmates is puberty blockers. Puberty blockers shut down the part of the pituitary that directs the release of hormones catalyzing puberty. The most common of these drugs is called Lupron, a drug that was originally used in the chemical castration of sex offenders. To this day, it has never been FDA approved to halt healthy puberty. Now you might ask, why would any parent or doctor do this? Why would anyone stop the puberty in a child, even a child with genuine gender dysphoria, when that child would be highly likely to outgrow the gender dysphoria if left alone? Some say because it's traumatizing to let a child go through the puberty of the sex to which they don't wish to belong. The problem of this, of course, is that in many cases, puberty does seem to have helped children overcome their gender dysphoria. But there really is no satisfying answer to why someone would do this, given that scientists have no way of predicting which children will outgrow the dysphoria on their own and which won't. But the argument that's made is that these kids can't wait. The suicide rates for the trans-identified youth and trans adults are very high, the argument goes, and so we need to get in there and start fixing them as soon and dramatically as possible. But unfortunately, there are no long-term studies that indicate that puberty blockers cure suicidality or even that they produce better mental health outcomes. There are not even good studies that show they are safe for this population long-term, nor that they are reversible. There's a big debate right now in the medical community about whether and to what extent the effects of stopping healthy puberty in adolescence is reversible if these kids later stop taking them. What we do know is that puberty blockers will block all the secondary sex characteristics, sexual maturation, and development of bone density from occurring. We do know that because of the inhibition of bone density and other risks, doctors don't like to keep a child on puberty blockers for more than 2 years. And we know that once a child's healthy puberty is arrested, placing her entirely out of step with her peers, this seems to guarantee that she will proceed to cross-sex hormones like testosterone. In studies, nearly 100% of kids who are put on puberty blockers proceed to cross-sex hormones. And we know that if a child goes from puberty blockers to cross-sex hormones, that child will be infertile. She may also have permanent sexual dysfunction, given that her sex organs never reached adult maturity, but she will certainly be infertile. So the claim that puberty blockers are safe and reversible for this population is not well-founded. And the claim that it's a neutral intervention, just a pause button, they say, without serious downsides, is simply false. In the US, Planned Parenthood gives out testosterone on a first visit. Depending on the state, it absolutely gives testosterone to minors. Planned Parenthood in Oregon gives it to 15-year-old girls on their own recognizance. They don't even need a parental note. Kaiser dispenses it. So for today's teens, whether they have real or typical gender dysphoria or not, testosterone is easily available. Double mastectomy, known as top surgery, is readily available. No, they do not necessarily need parental approval, depending on the state, and they definitely don't need a therapist's note.
In Miriam's book, Trans Nation, she gives a very detailed account of the long list of mental and physical health consequences of these sterilization drugs and cross-sex hormones. First, we have a girl who decided she was Leo and was put on puberty blockers. As her mom, Natalie, described it, at first Leo was happier. Then her mental health worsened. She attempted suicide several times. Her back, shoulders, and hips ached every day, but nothing was done. While the recommended length of treatment is 2 years, she stayed on blockers for over 4 years, eventually being sent for a bone density test and scans due to ongoing pain. The results? 15-year-old Leo had osteoporosis, spinal fractures, and vertebral damage. According to the drug manufacturer, those tests should have been done regularly. Normally, bones are strengthened during puberty, but Leo's puberty had been blocked, and her bones were weak like an old woman's. The effects of then being put on testosterone after puberty blockers is even more tragic. Here's the full list. They face hair loss, elimination of menstruation, deepening of the voice, severe acne, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, erythrocytosis, which includes symptoms of blurred vision, headaches, confusion, high blood pressure, nosebleeds, itching, weakness, and tiredness, cerebrovascular disease, hypertension, pelvic pain, and uterine cancer. There have been reports of intracranial hypertension in women on testosterone. This is an uncommon cause of severe headache that can cause visual loss from damage to the optic nerve. As compared to women not on testosterone, those treated with testosterone are almost 4 times more likely to have a heart attack. As compared to men, they are 4 times more likely to have a stroke. Clots in the veins, which can cause life-threatening pulmonary embolism, are 5 times more likely to happen in women treated with testosterone. These medical interventions of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones aren't really transitioning these kids to the opposite sex. They're deforming them. They're making them sick, disabled, and inflicting them with painful and debilitating medical conditions. They're guaranteeing a lower quality of life and an earlier death. For men put on puberty blockers and estrogen, the list is just as awful. In males, cross-sex hormones can lead to decreased muscle mass and strength, decreased sexual desire, decreased sperm production, voice changes, decreased testicular volume, erectile dysfunction, infertility, deep vein blood clots, stroke, coronary artery disease, and cerebrovascular disease. And then there's the fact that these procedures leave these children forever infertile. Blockers followed by cross-sex hormones prevent eggs and sperm from reaching full maturation, making reproduction impossible. And here's the last quote from Miriam's book, and I warn you, it gets pretty graphic. When a female takes testosterone, the profound and permanent effects of the hormone can be seen in a matter of months. Voices drop, beards sprout, body fat is redistributed. Sexual interest explodes, aggression increases, and mood can be unpredictable. Girls were disturbed by the effects of testosterone on their clitoris, which enlarges and grows into what looks like a microphallus or a tiny penis. I've heard from patients given testosterone that their clitorises have grown so large that they now constantly chafe against the child's pants, causing them pain when they walk. And for boys, keep in mind as well that with early hormonal interventions, your son's genitals will never appear normal. He will forever have a micropenis. And according to gender-affirming surgeon Marcy Bowers, he will not be able to orgasm. This is guaranteed. This is insane. This is what gender-affirming care means. It's an innocent-sounding word, but it is sadistic.
Well, we could be here all day talking about the Orwellian terms that we have in gender ideology. The term affirming, which of course, if you affirm someone's new identity, it means you have to deny their biology. But affirming is such a wonderful term. So if someone is not affirming, well then, you know, what kind of person would not affirm a child? That just sounds terrible. Now, that chapter that I have that's called Euphemisms is specifically about the euphemism top surgery, which to me, as a physician who, I'm enamored of female biology, reproduction, the biology of reproduction, the biology of pregnancy, of maternal-child bonding, you know, the magic, if I could say that word, of nursing and what goes on during nursing. It is magical. So to me, that term top surgery is just particularly offensive, as it leads young people, girls, obviously I'm primarily concerned about girls, to believe that it's not a big deal, It's the removal of, they're led to believe that your breasts are unnecessary sex objects. That's their purpose. You're not a girl, you're not a woman, so you don't need these objects on your chest.
What girls often do while on testosterone is bind their breasts, and there are serious consequences to these innocent-seeming binders. Abigail Schreier writes this: often a young woman's dysphoria increases with testosterone, as it occurs to her that even with a man's voice, body hair, square jaw, rounder nose, and full beard, she doesn't look exactly like a man. She still has breasts after all. By now, she has likely been binding for months or years, flattening her breasts in a compression sleeve. The binders aren't comfortable, and they pose risks of their own: back pain, shoulder pain, chest pain, shortness of breath, and bruised and fractured ribs. Binding can also permanently damage tissue, leaving breasts looking like deflated balloons, flat and wrinkled. And to get even more graphic, this is how Miriam Grossman describes what boys do to appear more feminine. A boy might shave his arms, legs, and chest to erase signs of masculinity. To achieve a flat feminine crotch, he'll push his testicles into his inguinal canals, then tape his penis and scrotum together behind his legs. This maneuver can cause severe pain, infection, and testicular torsion, an acute condition requiring emergency surgery. Holy shit! These kids are being brainwashed into doing the most unimaginable things to their bodies. Now, there's a long list of barbaric surgeries that these children undergo, but I'll just talk about mastectomies for now. The innocent-sounding euphemism for the surgery is top surgery, which really means removing a young girl's perfectly healthy breasts. Chloe Cole has been a brave and vocal detransitioner. She's speaking out against these horrific practices by sharing her own story. In this next clip, she describes the malpractice of her doctors. She describes how she was expected to make these life-changing decisions when she was just a kid, as if she could give consent at that age. And she explains how this whole transitioning journey culminated in her getting her breasts removed.
By this point in time, I was 2 or 3 years on testosterone, and I'd been binding for roughly the same amount of time, and my breasts had lost their shape. They didn't look like they used to before. They didn't really have, they didn't, to me, it just looked strange. And I actually just started developing more insecurities with my body as I went through my transition. Like I had like these masculine features pop up, but it was all still on a female body. And there was like an incongruence between different features on my body, and especially my breasts. Like it was this masculine looking body with quite a bit of muscle. And yet these things were there, and they weren't really in the best shape. And it became a source of insecurity for me. And, I thought that even if I wanted to, my chest would never be the same again. And so there was not really any point in keeping it. And before I went under the knife, they did tell me that I was going to lose my ability to breastfeed, but it was like, I'm going to be a man, and men don't do that. I also wasn't really thinking about being a parent at all, because I was a kid. Actually, this is kind of reminiscent of of one of the appointments for getting the testosterone. My endocrinologist asked me some questions that were very adult in nature. I was basically being sexualized by my doctors. It was like, are you aware that you may experience vaginal atrophy, or are you aware that this may affect your ability to have children as an adult? And I just went along with it. It was like, oh yeah, I know that. I don't plan on having kids, and I also I never had sex by that point, so I didn't know just what effect any of that would have on my body. But I was being treated as if I were an adult with the mental faculties to be able to consent to all this and understand what I was consenting to. But I wasn't. I was just a kid.
Okay, and so what happened in the aftermath of the surgery? What was that like for you?
When I woke up and I was fully conscious, all the meds had worn off, and I realized what just happened. But I was actually quite happy. It was like, wow, this is a huge accomplishment. This is a huge step, and I can finally be myself. And I was looking forward to being healed and eventually being able to go out and swim and work out and just hang out without a shirt and look like all the other boys and not have to worry about wearing this uncomfortable, restrictive thing. And, it was an outpatient surgery. Got sent home pretty soon after that. And I had a comfy, I guess you'd say, few weeks after that, because my mom had to take some time off work to just help me around the house. It was a major surgery in my upper body, and I lost a considerable amount of my range of motion. I couldn't even lift up my arms over my head until maybe about like 3 or 4 months afterward. So I wasn't really in a state to be going out on my own. But after about a week or so was when reality started to hit. I had to get my stitches taken out a few days afterward, and the sensation was just insane. Like, they had to cut and rearrange some nerve endings, so it was like, it was numb, but I could also feel everything that they're doing when they're taking out the stitches. And it felt so disgusting. And once I went home and I was able to finally bathe again, that was when I started having to, that's when I had to take off the surgical binder and the dressings and look down at what was left of my chest. You know, I had these big scars and all these markings from a surgical marker. And on top of that, I will, just a warning, I will get into graphic detail here, but the type of incision that I got was called double incision with nipple grafts, meaning that they would not only take out the breast tissue and contour the chest to look more masculine, they would also remove like the way it was explained to me, I guess because I was young and they were trying to make it more digestible to a 15-year-old, was that they would leave like a deep scrapes on both sides of my chest, kind of like a deep knee scrape, but more controlled. And they would remove my nipples and then place them in that area of scraped skin in they called a more masculine positioning and shape. It's barbaric, to say the least. And when I took the dressings off, when I looked down, the grafts, they were black because, you know, during the surgery, during the operation, the blood supply was cut off, and so the outer layer of skin had died. And they said that was how it was supposed to be, and that was just part of the process. But I couldn't bear to see that part of my body. And I had to see that every night. I had to change my. That was what I had to look at every single night after every bath, after every shower.
Now, there's so much more to talk about here. There's the gender ideology being taught to children from kindergarten upwards. They're taught that gender is fluid and that biological sex doesn't really exist. All that exists is your sex assigned at birth, which has nothing to do with your true gender identity. And then there's the idea that gender is a social construct, and by raising your child as a different sex, you can really turn your boy into a girl or your girl into a boy. This idea comes from a man named John Money, who brought this idea into the mainstream, but he deserves a whole video all on his own. I promise to cover these in future videos, but for now, I hope I've helped you wrap your heads around this crazy trans madness. We can be compassionate towards people who are dealing with transgender confusion, whatever kind it may be, but we do not have to play into the delusion that men can be women and that women can be men. We certainly don't have to agree that a man who is trans is a real woman, or that a woman who's trans is a real man, and we should not, by any means, allow the abuse of these vulnerable children and adolescents to go on. I know this was an intense one, but please share your thoughts in the comments. It might take me a while to answer, but I always try to answer all of them. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to subscribe because it helps the channel grow more than you know. Till next time, guys.